Welcome to Real Jam Radio. I am Danny Leroux, your host, and so happy to be with you for this episode. This week had the NBA Draft Lottery, and lots of big developments with that. The ended up final result was the Celtics actually turning the best lottery odds into the number one pick. Then the Lakers jumped from number 3 to number 2, and then the Philadelphia Sixers got the third pick via the swap with the Sacramento Kings, another Sam Hinkie special. And to talk about it with me is Sam Vecenie, longtime friend of the show, talented writer and draft expert. We go through not only the lottery and everything that happened there, but we go in a vastly wide-ranging conversation on a lot of different stuff. Really did enjoy it. It's a little bit less than 2 hours, so it is a behemoth, but fun conversation. I originally was going to have timestamps, but it's a little bit more lightly edited just because my schedule got filled with everything else that I'm doing. And some of the language is a little bit salty. I know most of you won't care, but I'm giving that warning for those people who do, that there are moments of this that get, some cuss words, but nothing too, doesn't last too long. It's not filled with them. They're in there at certain places. And this episode is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter is an amazing way to find new employees. It's fun to also do this from the employer side. I think that's an interesting wrinkle with ZipRecruiter, and it's a great way to find people. ZipRecruiter.com/sportsfan, and you can check it out for free. And now to the conversation with Sam, about 2 hours long. Thank you so much for coming on.
How are you doing today, Danny? It's only 11 o'clock here out on the West Coast, and it's already just been a long day, I would say, in the media world.
It certainly has been. And I mean, yesterday was wild for a lot of different reasons, and that's a big part of why we're discussing this. This is not going to be a detailed breakdown of Game 2 of Warriors Spurs. No. But yesterday's more interesting development was the NBA Draft Lottery, and it seems strange considering there wasn't that much movement that I just found it so intriguing, but that's really the way it worked out in terms of my view of the whole thing.
Yeah, it was really interesting because there was randomly a lot of movement, right? So Philadelphia ends up getting the pick from the Sacramento pick. The picks have swapped. I know that Mike Levin and Spike Eskin will be happy about that, but it was just a weird lottery, right? Because you get this Sacramento pick, they move up for the first time in 30 years, and ends up being going to Philadelphia, but Sacramento still gets number 5 instead of number 8, which I think is what they were slotted at. Boston keeps the pick, the Lakers keep their pick, which, the Lakers keeping this pick is it maybe the most important thing that has happened in their franchise, in the last 5 or 6 years, probably, right? Last night?
I would say so, because not only...
Since the title teams, I mean.
If you want to combine all of it into one thing, then I would say yes, because not only did they get the pick that should allow them to get the player that it sounds like they want, though, of course, that can change over the next month, sure, but they also retain their 2019 first-round pick, which would have been unprotected. And while there's a very real chance that the Lakers will be relevant at that point to some degree, I mean, how much will vary, but there's always a possibility that it's going to take a little bit longer to get going. We've seen it happen before. We'll see it happen again. And in that case, the Magic would have had this amazing asset. And we'll talk a little bit more about Orlando later, but that combination of factors is an absolutely huge win for Los Angeles. And I wrote about this for SI because I did my off-season preview of them last night, actually from Oracle for the most part. And what I talked about was that this gives them, the new revamped front office, a mandatory opportunity to reevaluate their entire current roster.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. Another kind of ancillary benefit here is that we now have certainty in terms of what picks they owe when, which creates a bit of certainty if they're going to have trade discussions, right? I feel like they were a little bit hamstrung over the course of the last few years because they were trying to figure out how they were going to be able to operate in terms of improving their roster. Now they have certainty. They know what they're going to have in the future, what they're going to be obligated to send out in 2018. And I think that that's a big factor. So you're also right, though. This is going to be a full-scale kind of evaluation of where this organization is, where it's going, and how they think that they can get back into prominence. Do they Brandon Ingram? Do they think Julius Randle is a piece of the future? Do they think that D'Angelo Russell is a good fit next to one of these point guards, or one of, if they really want to explore Jason Tatum for whatever reason, then it's just an incredibly important valuation of just where the organization is going forward.
They're also in an unusual spot, sort of paralleling where Utah was a couple of years ago with way less talent, in that they actually have a shorter time frame to make a decision on a lot of these things than some may think, because they drafted, Randall is extension eligible this summer. Russell is extension eligible next summer. That, you can wait until restricted free agency, even with the new higher cap holds for rookie scale guys. You can wait, but the problems with waiting are, one, there's always a risk involved in that, kind of in a couple different ways. One, that you might lose them for nothing, and two, that they're just not that good. And also the idea that their value, if you decide that, whether it's now or later, that they're not a part of the next great Lakers team, moving on that sooner rather than later is almost always a good idea.
Yep, because you get more value.
Right, because somebody else right now, they could be looking at what we've seen from D'Angelo Russell for 2 years and go, oh, look, the Lakers they've been such a train wreck, there's been all this other stuff going on. We can fix this.
Yep.
But especially if they interpret it, and I'm not saying that they have to, if they interpret what they're going to do in the draft as being somebody who kind of goes over D'Angelo Russell, then you get into a Jahlil Okafor circumstance where the downside risk is substantially higher than the upside risk in terms of the asset. And if you're putting this other guy over Russell, then you're making your own determination.
Man, that 2015 draft, it didn't get super sad in a hurry, but we got really excited after their rookie years, I think. And it's not seeming to be quite as strong at the top maybe as we thought it would be. Do we think that's fair?
Assuming we're counting the top, and we're not counting the top as just Towns, who I think has been better than I expected.
Towns has been way better than we expected, and I think Porzingis has been better than we expected. But is there anyone else that you're not just excited about? Because I think there are plenty of players to be relatively excited about. But everyone was super in on Stanley Johnson, and that's not really great. Justice Winslow is coming off an injury. Willie Cauley-Stein has been a problem. Mario Hezonja has been a problem. We haven't really seen Trey Lyles. I mean, Devin Booker and Miles Turner have worked out well. I'm still questionable, I think, a little bit more than other people are on them. But we thought this draft was going to be awesome. And it feels average now to me, I guess, right?
The other part of it that's unusual about 2015
I'm sorry,
is how many of these guys I don't feel comfortable with the idea necessarily of them being a starter. And you can earn that right over your third and fourth years, by all means.
Yep.
But even though most of these guys aren't the massive disappointments relative that Hezonja has been, you're still sitting there with Willie Cauley-Stein, with Moutier, with Frank Kaminsky, saying, well, what is this guy? Are they a low-end starter? Are they more of a rotation player? And there's still great values on their current contracts, but that starts to matter really soon because, as I said with Russell, these guys are going to be extension eligible. And another good manifestation of this, or representation, is Trey Lyles. Trey Lyles is in a spot where if he was performing well, the Jazz could really use him in basically whatever role, and he got completely marginalized by veterans, by talented veterans, but that's concerning.
Yeah, you're definitely right about the fact, are these guys starters or not? We just don't have an evaluation yet properly on Justice Winslow, for instance, right? Because this was supposed to be the year that he takes the leap, and that didn't really happen. Cameron Payne, I think we can feel pretty confident is probably not a starter, but Frank Kaminsky, obviously. You've got Trey Lyles, who hasn't really even got a crazy chance to play yet. It's a really weird draft class, really super weird. But I think that we can kind of tie this into getting back to the last discussion, right? So in the 2014 and 2015 drafts, the Philadelphia 76ers kind of held the key to the draft at number 3, right? Because in 2014, we knew that it was going to be Andrew Wiggins, Jabari Parker. And then how the 76ers went was going to tell the tale of the draft. In 2015, we thought it was going to be Towns. And to be honest, even up to draft night, we kind of thought it was going to be Jahlil Okafor. And then we kind of thought the 76ers would take Russell after that, but we weren't certain either. So we kind of thought that how they operated on draft night was going to tell the tale of the draft again. So again, now here we are 2 years later, they're at number 3 again, and they're again going to kind of tell the tale of this NBA draft. So you look at number 1 and number 2. I think number 1 is going to be Markelle Fultz, and I think number 2, I think Lonzo Ball is the heavy favorite to go number 2. I don't think it's certain by any means, but I think that he is pretty likely to be the number 2 overall pick. That puts the 76ers in a position again where, this organization is going to be able to kind of dictate how the rest of the top 10 goes. Because for me and for a lot of other people, this is something like at the, top level in terms of like the top 3 tiers of players. This is a 10 to 11 person draft. And the way that those 10 to 11 players shake out is going to be incredibly dependent on what the 76ers do at number 3.
That's a great point. And are you thinking there's a possibility that they're going to trade this pick? Because that's something I've been considering, just on the idea that if somebody else loves one player of this group above all others, they know that they're not getting into the top 2. Like, basically, unless those picks are traded for an established player, I don't see a team moving into the top 2. So that means a team has to negotiate with the Sixers if they want somebody in particular.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And to be honest, I think that puts the 76ers they're in I don't want to say a bad spot because they're going to get a really good player, but they're not in a perfect spot either, because it does feel like their best fit to me outside of that top 2 is probably Malik Monk, but I think he'd be a risky pick at number 3. I don't want to say he would be a reach at number 3, because I think there's a world where he's just incredible next to Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons and averages like 23 points a night. But I think that there's a lot more downside at number 3 with Malik Monk than what a typical number 3 pick would have. So that does put them in an interesting position, because you would think that Phoenix is not going to take Monk at 4. You would think Sacramento is not going to take Monk at 5. So you can kind of move down maybe to number 6 at least with Orlando or one of those 2 other picks if they really want someone, and still get the guy that fits your roster best. So the trade down idea is really interesting to me.
And so much of this draft, this is often true, but I think those players from 3 to 10, 11, wherever we're going to say it, are so even that beauty in the eye of the beholder makes for a really fun draft night.
Yep.
Because certain teams are going to see the board specific ways, and considering we're in a spot now in the league where the teams aren't going to be hoarding like cap space or anything like that, I think they're going to be a little bit more pragmatic about where they are. That it might open up moves, it might not. It just kind of depends on how the board shakes out. But
yep.
I'm excited for it because there's so much more volatility, and because a lot of these players, there are a series of different point guards, there are a series of different kind of combo-y forwards. They're not the same guys. This is not a circumstance where it's like, oh, well, we'll take Jason Tatum, and if he's not there, then we'll take, Jonathan Isaac. They're very different guys. There are teams that could approach it that way. Minnesota is a potential one of those, but they're very different sales, and these point guards are all incredibly different. And so I could see a team falling in love with one of them and saying, we want to make sure this guy comes to us. And the part that I think is so fun about this is Minnesota in particular, and I'm not saying they're going to do this, I don't expect that they will, but a few of these teams in the kind of 7 to 10 range have a fair amount of assets. Sacramento has all these kind of overlapping big men that maybe somebody's going to like. The Knicks, they don't have a ton in terms of assets, but they have players like Kyle O'Quinn that's intriguing, and they could do a couple different things. And Minnesota, actually, the one I've been kind of running around in my brain since the lottery happened is, what if they dangled Zach LaVine, if there was one of these guys that they really liked? And while LaVine's going to be out for a while, that is such an amazing lottery ticket for the Sixers.
So yeah, that's a really interesting one to me, because if they fall in love with Josh Jackson, for instance, Minnesota, that's interesting because I am intrigued by how he would fit with like Andrew Wiggins on the wing. How do you think that would work? I guess it would be really intriguing if I was convinced that Tibbs would play small consistently, but do you think that'll happen?
It's possible. My bigger concern is also that they have just so many guys on this team that can't shoot.
Yeah, exactly. Like that too. Like Chris Dunn is your point guard of the future, or Ricky Rubio, if you just have lost faith in Chris Dunn for whatever reason, is your point guard of the future. So like, what do you do with Josh Jackson?
Right. And it's a big challenge for them, because even if you see him as the best fit, you know, like maybe he's their Luol Deng is kind of a way to put it.
Yeah.
Then you need the other guys. And this is also a very different NBA than the teams that with Tibbs, with Derrick Rose and Noah that did so well. You need so much more spacing now, because teams, especially if you want to be a title contender at some point, if you have a player on either end of the floor that teams feel comfortable, you know, kind of handling differently, they will do it. We're seeing that pretty amazingly in these playoffs. And so I feel better about Josh Jackson being above that level, you know, kind of like the Tony Allen offensive player. And I mean, Tony Allen's first team all defense, he's a legitimately awesome guy, but those issues are coming to bear so much more often now than they did before.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Josh is a better offensive player than Tony Allen, just in terms of the way that he reads the floor, and I think his jump shot's a little bit better. But having said that, you're right in that Minnesota needs a guy, you know, theoretically, at least in terms of the way their roster looks on paper, right? Like, we don't know what Tibbs thinks they need, but they need a guy who can shoot the basketball. And if you trust, for me, their best fit is Jonathan Isaac, right? Like, if I was them, I would just be happy that Jonathan Isaac would fall to number 7, because it looks like the board, and you did just mention, you know, like all of these guys are so different and all these teams could fall in love with different players. But I think you can feel with reasonable confidence right now that one of Josh Jackson, Jason Tatum, or Jonathan Isaac will fall to Minnesota at 7. And all of those guys present their own sorts of issues, but they all present this is bad English. They all present very high-end strengths, we'll say. I was going to say strong strengths, but they all present very high-end strengths that would fit well in Minnesota. So Jason Tatum would be the kind of creator off the wing who can shoot the basketball a little bit that I think would fit pretty well with Andrew Wiggins and would give them a dynamic offensive team as well as a long, switchable defensive team. You know, Josh Jackson, obviously, he would give them the mentality that I think Tibbs wants, because it doesn't seem to me that Karl Towns or Andrew Wiggins really have that like crazy competitive drive, right? Like, I'm not saying they're not competitors. I'm saying that, you know, Josh Jackson is a top 1% competitor, and I think that could be beneficial to them. And then Jonathan Isaac, in terms of fit on the floor, he's probably the best out of all of them, right? Because I think he might have more defensive upside than anyone in this draft. He really gets after it on that end. And plus, he can shoot the ball a little bit from deep. He'd fit really nicely as a 6'11 guy next to Karl Towns and Andrew Wiggins. So all of those guys work for me there. And if I was them, I would probably be pretty cool standing pat as the draft currently sits, but you don't know who's going to move up and down, as you say. So do you have to kind of play some game theory to, you know, quote the name of my podcast, but like, you kind of have to theorize this out, right? So is a team going to move up? Is the team going to move down? You know, are they going to come up and try and, you know, take one of these forwards and reshuffle the draft board in a way? It's kind of a tricky process for Minnesota. Ultimately, the way the board stands now, I would feel okay standing pat. But as draft night comes, you have to prepare yourself for a lot of scenarios, right? And I would make sure, if I was them, to be prepared to where I can get one of those like wing forwards that really fit my roster well.
I hadn't really considered this too much until we started talking, but I don't expect them to use their assets in this way. But if Denver really liked someone like Isaac, he would be a fascinating fit next to who they already have.
Oh, I love that fit. I talked about this last night on my show with Chris Stone. I think that he is probably like him to the Timberwolves is such an interesting fit, just because he is an awesome defender at 6'11" who can switch everything. He can defend a lot of different positions. A good weak side rim protector. I think that Karl Towns, you know, he's been okay so far protecting the rim. I think he's going to get stronger as a primary rim protector. Having said that, Isaac would fit as a weak side rim protector as he continues to develop that side of his game. Offensively, I think Isaac's going to be able to hit corner threes pretty early in his career. The key is going to be, can he stretch it out to around to above the break? Can he become a more consistent a more consistent guy attacking off the dribble, just a more consistent, confident offensive basketball player in a way. Because, if you look at what he did this year at Florida State, I know he was surrounded by Xavier Rattan-Mays. I know he had Dwayne Bacon on that roster. Neither of those two guys wanted to pass. They pounded the ball on the perimeter, but he really didn't assert himself offensively when he was clearly the most talented player on that roster. So he'd be a great fit there. I worry about Tibbs and his confidence levels under a guy that would be harder on him and would, really get after him a little bit. But I think that on the floor, that's an awesome fit.
Something else that I think makes this draft more compelling is the idea that Orlando could actually change paths, because now that they're going to have a new general manager, new front office, that changes, their willingness to draft a point guard. Because I think if Hennigan was still there, they would have kept Elfrid Payton as kind of the lead guy. They already paid a bunch of money to DJ Augustine, so you have to go in that direction. But the idea of Isaac to the Wolves, or just kind of some of those other dynamics, kind of rely on Orlando taking a guard. But of course, that doesn't have to be a point. It could be Malik Monk.
Right. So if I'm Orlando, I'm taking a guard. Like, I've never been a believer in Elfrid Payton. Like, I had Payton in the low 20s on my board whenever he was drafted. I thought they reached for him whenever they traded the Dario Saric pick, plus their, what was it? I guess it was number 12, plus another pick in the future that Philadelphia was owed
Philly's
to
own
them.
pick. They gave Philly their own pick back.
Yeah, so I thought they overpaid for him, and I thought that they overdrafted him, and I still have not seen much of a reason to believe in him, right? Like, what has he improved upon as an NBA player, I guess, is my question. Like, he's a better free throw shooter, I guess. He's finishing better at the rim, but the flaws in his game are still so readily apparent that it's difficult for me to see how he gets past them. Like, with a guy like Emmanuel Mudiay, I'm a little bit more confident that he can get past those flaws, just given what we've seen from him on lower level circuits, right? Like, he's a guy that showed off better mid-range skill. He's a guy that has just better instincts, I think, in the pick and roll. Maybe he's not the athlete that Peyton is in terms of quickness, but I just have like a little bit more faith that he's going to figure it out as a scorer, because I think that I have a little bit more faith in his distribution ability. With Peyton, I'm not quite there yet, I guess. Like, what do you think of Peyton? Because that's ultimately going to be the deciding factor in terms of where Orlando goes.
I think it's a hard path for him to become a true starter. It's possible, but unlikely. And also remember, Elfrid Payton is 23. He is almost exactly 2 years older than both Mudiay and D'Angelo Russell.
Yeah.
And so those guys, those guys are young still. And point guards can take a lot of time. But Payton, the jump shot is a big problem. He does show some spark defensively, and every once in a while you see him do something off the dribble. Like, he's not terrible.
He's not useless by any stretch.
Like, he has value, and that's also part of the reason why paying DJ Augustine the money they did was so devastating, is because they already have a cost-controlled rotation point guard if they need it. Like, if they got somebody above him, whether that is a rookie or just using their money, unfortunately, they already have so much tied up in Augustine that they can't. That's basically untradeable at this point, that they can't do it. So I think that's a concern for them. But of course, if you get it cost controlled on a rookie deal, you can make it work. But I also think that nobody in their front court rotation has been so good that you decline a forward if you think they're the better player.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that too. I mean, it depends on what you think of Aaron Gordon, I guess, right? Like, do you believe in Aaron Gordon in terms of like the 4 position, and where do you fall on like Terrence Ross and Yvonne Fournier playing together, I guess? And, they also have a lot of money tied up in center as well because of Nikola Vucevic and Bismack Biyombo. This was such a poorly constructed roster. Like, can we just kind of talk about that? Like, I had so much faith in Rob Hennigan, just like from every sort of, anecdote that you hear talking to people around the league, that like this guy is super, super sharp and he has a great eye for talent and all of that jazz. But I don't know if it was owner interference or, he felt like he was kind of trying to save his job, or if he just genuinely like kind of screwed up building the roster. But they totally misjudged the marketplace kind of in terms of big men, and they totally misjudged the marketplace in terms of how important spacing was going to be like on offense.
They also have a really challenging roster construction to fix because it's the death by 1,000 cuts cap structure. This is the same issue that the Phoenix Suns have. So when you have a lot of money and it's in a lot of different players, like, nobody on the Suns makes more than 17 million. Or sorry, nobody on the Suns does, or nobody on the Magic. Actually, they both have the similar structure in that way.
Yeah.
But what that means is, you can clear space if you have to. Like, I don't think they have any truly horrendous contracts, but they have just so much on the except for Augustine, but he's lesser money. And the problem is that it gets harder sometimes to actually make those moves, because if it's one piece, then you can go, okay, we'll offer X blah 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 in exchange for you getting that. Like, we could see that probably not this summer, but next summer with the Lakers guys, with Evan Turner. But with Orlando, you're just kind of sitting there like, okay, like, not only is that, but you have limited flexibility and your team just isn't that good. Like, I think that getting guys above, like, if you can slide everybody down the totem pole, they'll look a lot better. You see that fairly frequently with teams. But the problem is they don't have the money to slide everyone down the totem pole.
Do you think that Nikola Vucevic would get a first-round pick?
No.
You don't? Just straight up don't believe that?
No, I think...
Like, say that, oh, man, it gets tricky to try and find one, I guess.
Yeah, that's why I wrote a piece for the Sporting News about how basically it's going to be hard to trade centers, because not only do you have a really high supply, but you also have a really low demand.
Yep,
because
this is something I've been talking about too in terms of like the NBA draft. So yeah, no, 100% agree on this.
Yeah, and so with Vooch, his contract is reasonable and he's not a bad player, but there aren't as many teams with cap space as there were before. And there are not many, like, basically to me, if you're going to trade for somebody like him, it is on the belief that he can be your starter. And that is a harder sales pitch than it was before. And this is the exact same problem Oklahoma City is going to get into if they try to trade Enes Kanter.
You know who kind of effed this up a little bit, I think? Washington probably could have traded a first-round pick for Vucevic this year when they traded for Bojan instead.
Well, yeah, but the problem is they already have Jan, Mahimi, and Gortat. And
that
would be a strange use of resources. And it would have been fascinating to see if Orlando theoretically would have been willing to take on some bad money in exchange. Because, like, in some ways, that's actually one of the bigger parts of that Brooklyn-Washington trade, was that they were willing to take on Andrew Nicholson's contract.
Yep.
Orlando is not all the way there, but they're close enough to having messed up books for the next 2 years where I would consider those types of deals instead of trying to make a splash in free agency.
I think I agree with you. Like, I don't know that I would have taken on Mahinmi's deal, but if you would have, and honestly, I'm not even sure they could have taken on Nicholson. Could they have?
What do you mean?
Because he came from Orlando, right? So like,
but I believe that was an outright signing. And if you sign a guy from another team, that's fine. It's not a circumstance like what happened why the Nets can't reacquire
Alan Crabb or Motor
or basically any of the million guys they tried to sign with offer sheets.
Yeah, really. But no, like to me, like, I consider Jan Mahinmi a sunk cost at this stage, right? Like, I just do.
Oh, I don't at all.
Really?
I think he can play. I think that his injuries were not the type of thing that I think are going to really linger. I mean, you worry about him being injury prone, but you don't worry about recurrence in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that when he's healthy, he can play. He's not probably a starting caliber center at this point. Maybe in a pinch, I like him defensively. I think he can fit in well. I think we saw that with Indiana, just how much they missed him. And they also need him to a point, or they need someone as protection in case Gortat ages poorly. And it's hard to find that guy. And I don't think the other part with Washington, and we're going to have this conversation with a series of different teams, and you love cap structures like I do, where getting out of salary is more of a luxury than anything else, because it doesn't afford them, just like it won't afford the Blazers if they were going to try to trade Myers Leonard or whoever, it doesn't afford them any more team building flexibility other than if they can do it and get a trade exception, which then poses the same problems. So you can do that. Teams have gone that route for a long time. I'm sure some people will be frustrated if their teams choose to do it, especially considering, like, the Blazers, ownership signed off on those moves just a year ago. But that's a very different thing from trading picks or using that sort of thing to unload somebody to sign someone better, like the Warriors did with Iguodala, like Boston might end up doing if they really go after it this year. They could also just clear the space themselves. But those sorts of opportunities are a different sales pitch than, hey, this guy is not worth the money he is, and this will save you $15 million a year.
Yeah, no, it's 100% a different sales pitch. I agree with you. You have a lot more faith in Mahinmi than I do. I'll say that. I have concerns about the way that injuries, just like the breadth of injuries that continue to pile up, will affect his athleticism going into his later years. And given that his defensive value is so much of what he does, I'm a little bit worried. Going forward on Orlando, though, I don't know what to do if I was them, just generally. I would just probably take the best player available that's not in the front court, I think. And maybe you can say that that's Jason Tatum. If you think you can play him at the 3, maybe you can say that that is Malik Monk or it's a point guard. But they're in a really tricky spot, too. I agree with you, because their roster has just been bungled so badly at this stage.
So I talked about the idea that for Orlando, I don't think there's anybody on their roster that, that you work around. The idea that they have a lot of good players, and I think you can make a lot of things fit. And that's also kind of what you want for a draft pick. You want it to be where they don't have, especially if it's a non-elite guy, where they don't have a lot of pressure, but they have opportunity. And I think that's what Orlando can bring. I feel like the Suns are the same type of thing. I mean, Devin Booker's maybe the exception here. I think that, but I mean, if you...
Where are we at on Devin Booker? I want to hear where you're at. I think it's tough.
Booker is a talent as a scorer. I think that he can be a part of a successful offense, but I don't think he can be the best offensive player on a successful offense. That sort of dynamism requires having the ball in your hands now. I don't think you can really do that. And even, Kevin Durant has the ball in his hands a lot, and I don't think Booker's, near that level, obviously. And then the defensive part of it isn't as important considering he's a 2, but does still matter. I mean, if a guy is a sieve, you have to work around that. And I mean, we're seeing that in the playoffs as well. And so I think Booker can be a part of a successful team. The other worry I have is the timeline for them, because even though Booker's still young and he's still cost controlled for another couple of years, the Suns are a long way away, and they should actually make themselves further away, because there's no reason to have Eric Bledsoe on this team.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
So basically what I'm looking a little bit into the future with them and saying, okay, what's going to happen when he's extension eligible and they have to sit there and go, well, crap, like, what are we going to do here? A year and a half from now. And they go, well, okay, what is he? What are we going to do? I am anticipating with a lot of these guys, even though they've changed the incentives a little bit with the raised cap holds, which I talked about before, they just changed the calculation and made it so that guys just cost more, which is, I think, a good decision. After the way that guys like Drummond and Kawhi game the system, and I'm giving them credit for it, to help their teams get better.
Yep.
So
Beal did the same thing. Yep.
The benefit of that waiting time for an uninspiring draft class is that you can gain more certainty. So I think that basically every single team that has a player other than Towns, and I think there's an interesting discussion to have there, like in especially that 2015 draft, but also 2014, to negotiate from a position of strength, to basically say, if you want to leave a lot of money on the table, we'll extend you. We'll give you a deal that we feel comfortable with, but you have not played well enough to exert leverage on us to get that money now.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be harder to do with Devin Booker, though.
Maybe. And they also could be dealing with a new front office at that point. And I think then they would have a little bit more comfort doing it, just because, that's kind of their job. But I think, and I'm not, it's so funny to say this considering how badly teams spent last summer, but I feel like the cap realities now that things are not going to be jumping up for a while, that it has to start drilling in for some of these front offices to say, what are we gaining from making this commitment right now? Because when you have match rights, you're not worried about them leaving. You're more worried about them being unhappy or them playing better and raising their value. One of those is a good problem to have, which is, them playing better. The other one is a huge benefit that you don't have to worry about them leaving. So yes, it's awkward. Yeah, it's imperfect. And that doesn't mean a deal will fail, that you'll fail to get deals done. It just means that you negotiate on a harder line and don't sign those ones. Like Gorgie Jang is probably the poster child for me of this. Like,
that was a weird one.
It's not a horrendous contract, but think about where the Timberwolves would be in terms of flexibility, in terms of everything else, if they hadn't signed that contract. Maybe they would end up signing him to something similar to that. Maybe they would end up, in a similar place if they don't and draft somebody in that spot.
Who is offering him that money this offseason?
Probably no one.
It's 14 a year on average, right? I think he got 456, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. And so you have this big issue with him. And also, they gave him certainty when he hadn't earned it. Even if you think, he's going to be our big man next to Karl Anthony Towns.
By the way, I think he's good. Like, I think I'm a little bit higher on him than you are. I agree with you with what you're about to say, though.
But there was not a reasonable argument when the extension happened that they knew that to be true. Yep. And you can't make those decisions because when your team has flexibility, because they're really going to lose out on that. They could have had more money. They could have gone in more directions. And especially assuming the Pekovic injury exclusion goes through, they could be a serious player in free agency if somebody wants to take their money. So not only then do you have the idea of giving them money that they're not necessarily worth, but you're also changing the nature of an asset, because you could say that if they waited, the worst case scenario with Jang was losing him for nothing. Mm-hmm. Creating a net negative asset when you have cap space is actually worse than that. Because that's money you can't use on other things. And if it's a net negative, that means you're probably not going to find somebody who will want them. So then you're either tying an asset or you're reducing your flexibility. So I don't know if teams will learn from that. Actually, one of the franchises that will be dealing with that this summer, to tie it back a little bit, is Orlando. Because Orlando has extension negotiations with Aaron Gordon and Elfrid Payton this summer. Both of those guys, despite having, the cap holds, Elfrid Payton's, I have it at about 10 million. Aaron Gordon's is going to be about 16. That will be complicated, and they have to be responsible about it, because neither of those guys, I don't think you could sit there and just point to say, this is what they're going to be on the next good Magic team.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that point, that's a really good point with Minnesota, and kind of tying it back to Gorgie Jang, right? Because they have Shabazz Muhammad here, who has a cap hold this summer. Like Gorgie Jang could have had that cap hold this summer that would have been considerably lower than what they have him at 14 million next year on the books. I just this is a team that could have had 30 million in cap space, something like that, if they don't sign Gorgie Jang, and you just decide, Shabazz Muhammad, if we sign someone, we can get rid of his cap hold and just really rescind his rights, right? Rescind the qualifying offer and just kind of move on from him. They're in such a weird spot now that they almost have to nail this draft pick. I think that because they allocated the resources they did on Gorgie Jang, I should say that they have to nail this offseason now. Because if you don't nail this offseason and don't nail this draft pick, you're going to be pretty limited in terms of what you can do going forward. Because I would imagine that they're probably going to have to renegotiate with Andrew Wiggins here. Like, they're probably going to sign him to an extension, right? Like, that's just what's going to happen. Even though we just went through that whole thing, that's what's going to happen, right? Like, it's just they're going to sign him to an extension, I think, right?
Well, the difference with Wiggins, if they're going to spend their money this summer, is that they're not sacrificing future flexibility. Right. You might be committing in an imperfect way. And Wiggins has some of that kind of Otto Porter-ness where you expect that even if he disappoints, he's still going to get a mammoth offer from somebody. So,
well, he's Otto Porter with ceiling, though, too.
Right, exactly. So if Otto Porter can get a max offer, which I expect that he will, then Andrew Wiggins is set. That's a part of this. And so,
you think Otto Porter is going to get 102 or whatever?
I'm not certain of it, but I think it's going to happen. There are just no wings. You know, like, and not only that, but think about how some of the wings that are on the market are probably going to end up on teams that already have plenty. So you're going to see the have-nots stay have-nots. So Gordon Hayward is an amazing example of this. Gordon Hayward is on the Jazz. The Jazz are one of the few teams in the league that have a lot of perimeter players that are good. Mm-hmm. The other rumored destination for Gordon Hayward is the Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics are one of the other few teams that have a lot of wings.
Yeah. Well, it's because smart front offices stay being smart front offices, right?
Like, well, and Kevin Durant's another example. That's like Kevin Durant's presumably going to stay with the Warriors. So, you know, that if you look at really who is on the market, especially considering most of the restricted guys are going to stay put, at least the ones that are worth it, it's, you know, you don't have that many other options. And while I thought Alan Crabb, his offer was a little bit too rich for me. I've said this before. I would not have matched it if I were Portland, but it was a close call. I openly admit that. Otto Porter is a better player right now than Alan Crabb was then. And
Otto Porter is also a better value on $25 million than Alan Crabb is at 18.
Right. So if you're Brooklyn or some of those other teams, especially if you're not planning on spending your money this summer, to just kind of say, well, why the heck not? The worst case scenario is they match and you make an agent really happy. Not a bad thing. And
you hamstring a team potentially into the future.
Yes, and in the case of the Brooklyn-Washington thing, you hamstring a team in your conference.
Yep.
So, and they get luxury tax bill, and Brooklyn already benefited from a hamstrung Washington team. Like, they got a first-round pick out of this. So
Brooklyn should be maxing every restricted free agent, basically. That, like, is reasonably close to being worth a max, right? Like,
yeah, so they can be this idea. I talked about this for the Sixers a few years ago. Be the team that just sets the market on all these guys. And the Sixers actually did this in one of the most shocking ways possible with Manu Ginobili last year, where they basically just made him a rich offer and forced the Spurs to pay more money. That was a little bit of a different thing. I feel like that was kind of Brian Colangelo being Brian Colangelo. But the Sixers kind of had that opening to just basically say, hey, you know, X player, if you're looking for a team to give you money to give leverage on the other one, we'll do it. Because while there are bad contracts now, the NBA's misguided structure of graduating the maximums from 25 to 30 to 35 based on experience, not on like how good players actually are, makes it a lot harder to give bad contracts to young guys who are actually good. You can give bad contracts to young guys who aren't good, Miles Plumlee, but it's harder with players who are at a position of value and who can actually contribute. And I am not a big Otto Porter fan. I don't like the idea of players who can't be lead defenders, lead scorers, or lead ball handlers. Like, I just don't think those players have that much value on title contending teams. Mm-hmm. But not every team is a title contending team. And so here's the full list of here's the full list of who the Nets should max, right? They should max Otto Porter. They should max Caldwell Pope. They should not max Kelly Olynyk, but they should throw him like $18 million a year, right? That's too much for me.
I don't think he's worth that.
I don't think Olynyk can start.
I don't think he's worth that, but I don't think that if you give him $18 million a year with a team option on the third year, that it's going to hamstring you in the future when you're trying to contend either. And it just fucks with I'm sorry. Whoops, I can't swear on this podcast, but it just messes with Boston.
I don't feel as comfortable in that. For me, basically what I would be doing if I were Brooklyn is sitting there going, okay, in 2019, what of these contracts will we be able to live with at that point? So I guess if you're saying it's a 2+1, that gets a little bit more tolerable, but I don't think you do that. I don't think Olynyk has the upside to justify it. The other guy that's on this list that you haven't mentioned is Nerlens Noel.
Right. Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Nerlens is tricky for a lot of reasons.
But
what about Tony Snell too? He's on this list too.
I don't think I necessarily max him, but you could give him money. You make the Jazz pay for Joe Ingles.
I think Snell's worth like $12 million a year or something, probably. I mean, again, like throw him the Alan Crabb contract.
I mean, you do worry a little bit if you're Brooklyn. If you do it for a full 4 years, you worry about that hamstringing your team eventually because they're not going to be good for the next couple of seasons anyway. But that might be a little rich for Snell, but that's not bad. And then basically, it's just driving up the price a little bit on these guys. They can drive up the price on Jonathan Simmons if they want.
Andre Robertson.
Yeah. So there are a lot of those players that they might as well do that. But
Ingles is a good one too. I like that.
You have to be responsible about it. You don't want to end up holding the bag like they nearly did with Allen Crabbe. I mean, to me, the prototype of this is the Enes Kanter contract by the Blazers, which was a magnificent troll. But if they had ended up with that contract, that would have screwed up a lot of what they did. So actually, though,
the one that they could really mess with is Denver with Mason Plumlee, because there's going to be internal pressure from Denver to match.
Former net Mason Plumlee?
Exactly, but there's going to be internal pressure from Denver to match that. Basically, whatever it is, just given what they spent on acquiring him.
Well, I don't think they necessarily see it that way because of how Nurkic how that situation worked out.
There's also the first round pick there too.
Yeah, but Connell, I think that's a little bit. I think you're playing a dangerous game with a backup, and at this point, I think Denver knows pretty clearly that he's a backup.
Yeah,
and so I wouldn't push it with Plumlee personally. I would actually.
What would you offer him?
If you're going to push it for a backup center, I would go with Cristiano Felicio.
Yeah, he's interesting to me.
Who is intriguing, and Chicago is a more relevant team to Brooklyn's situation, and I think he has a lot more upside. I think he's like 3 years younger.
I also think he's just considerably not as good as Mason Plumlee at basketball. He's good, but Mason was, a starting caliber center on the Blazers.
Yeah, but I think it all depends on value. Like, I wouldn't give...
Right, like you wouldn't give Felicio the Plumlee.
The same money I would give Mason Plumlee.
Right,
but,
exactly.
Yeah, so, I mean, but the Nets can go in they can go in so many different directions, and I don't know how many other teams are in that boat, but they certainly are. And then I don't think we've talked enough about the Sixers, because they have just a fascinating circumstance, not only because, they're getting the third pick this year, so out of that pick swap, respect to Sam Hinkie, of course, but they also
how great was the banner last night?
It was phenomenal. I was in the interview room at Oracle, I was in the media room watching that and just dying. But think about where they are in kind of a broad scope thing. So they have some intriguing talent. I mean, I love Joel Embiid. You do too. Mm-hmm. And just, we'll see what Ben Simmons becomes. And they have a lot of like Robert Covington I really like. I'm intrigued by TLC. And they even have some nice backup guys, like TJ McConnell. I think he can be a backup point guard. There is real value to that if you have those guys under team control. So you have those elements. They have the third pick in this draft. They have a ton of cap space. But lingering in the back of their mind is also they have unprotected picks in the next 2 drafts after this one from teams that we do not expect to be playoff teams that season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Lakers
in 18 and then the Kings in 19.
I wonder how good the Lakers are next year. I don't think they're going to be disastrous like they were this year, right?
Well, okay, so Nate and I talked about this a little bit on Dunked on Tuesday night, and I think they're going to be tanking ambivalent. I think they're going to be winning ambivalent. So their goal is not going to be just, killing it for next year, but they will be better just because they're better. But remember, they had Lou Williams for a lot of this year, and Lou Williams was the best player on the Lakers last year, and they're still young, they're still figuring a lot of this out. So I think
and a lot of their wins came late in the year too.
Right. So I think they'll be better, but also remember that as of now, I think this is also because the talent level around the league is getting better. It's also being distributed a little bit differently. I don't think that the worst teams in the league, other than maybe the Nets, are going to be as bad as they were, particularly 2 years ago, but I would say also this year. And so
this year it wasn't too bad, I didn't think. Yeah.
Yeah. So my theory with the Lakers is they're going to be towards the bottom of the league. No, maybe not the absolute bottom. But then what happens is when other teams kind of reach the trade deadline, Valentine's Day, and realize, okay, we're not in it and we're going to fall back, they'll go ahead of a bunch of teams. Kind of like New Orleans did this year. Mm-hmm. Where they had similar incentives. And so I think that's going to be what happens with them. So the Sixers will get, if I had to guess right now, something around like this, like the 6th through 9th pick, something in that range. And that's a valuable resource for them. But what the Sixers then have to do is they're kind of playing this complicated game, which is very different from almost every other team in the league, because they can get good if they want, but they need to time this out. Because I think that spending a ton of money on Kyle Lowry, spending a ton of money on George Hill, Like, that makes you better right now, but when is the best Sixers team in the next 5 years? My instinct is it's probably closer to year 3 or year 4 than year 1 or year 2.
How much value do you ascribe in getting, so say you give George Hill a 2+1 contract, a 2 plus a player option contract at $25 million a year or something. Actually, he'll probably get more than that. Let's say $30 million a year. Say that you did something like that. Where would you say, what kind of value would you ascribe to just putting your young guys in the right position? Like putting Ben Simmons in a natural developmental spot next to a lead guard that doesn't need the ball in his hands. Putting Joel Embiid with a competent level, not only shooter, but who can space the floor, but also a perimeter defender who will kind of allow him to grow and mature in terms of the way that he defends. It's
very valuable. I think that it can really help. And then also they can get, theoretically, that could allow them to get playoff reps before those best teams.
Yeah.
What makes the Sixers...
And George Hill's $25 million, right? I'm sorry for cutting you off, but he's not $30 million, right?
Yeah, because he doesn't have enough experience.
Right. He's in his 8th or 9th year.
Right. Yeah, he signed a 5-year extension with the Spurs and then eventually was traded. Yeah. But the Sixers are in a different spot than almost all of these other teams. Kind of parallels the Celtics to a degree, which I'm sure Sixers fans will love. But their cap space could end up becoming substantially more valuable than it is right now, because all it takes to go from being an afterthought for high-level free agents to being in the room is success.
Yep.
Future success, present success. And I don't think the Sixers are going to be in that room for Gordon Hayward this year, but if they make the playoffs, which is possible, I don't think we'll have to see what they do with their space. But like, if they saved their money, if they hoarded their money and really used it, to extract resources or something like that, they, either next year or the year after, they can be in the place where they can add elite talent without having to give up assets. And if they can do that and have unprotected picks from the Lakers and the Kings coming, that's how you become a title team.
Yeah.
And so that's the opportunity that they're potentially losing with George Hill. But something to remember is that the free agent class next year, I've been looking into this a little bit because I was been thinking about the Paul George situation. And I don't think that next year's free agent class really has much, unless they love Derek Favors, but that poses its own problems. I don't think it has much in the way of players that are particularly good fits for where the Sixers are going. Like guys like Gordon Hayward, who are young and unrestricted, just don't hit the market that much. And the new designated veteran structure is going to make that even harder.
So we're talking 2018 free agency class, right?
2018 or even, I haven't looked into 2019 too much yet, but yeah, those would be the 2 years that if I'm the Sixers, you're sitting there going, who's going to have a better pitch than we are? Because by that point, Boston will have used their flexibility, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Cleveland has no space, and LeBron will be older then. I mean, he's a cyborg, so he'll probably still be good. But the Sixers are that buzzy team that they could be really good. They could be able to add a player on top of a successful franchise. And Philadelphia is not a major market, but it is still, it's on the East Coast. It's big market adjacent. It's very close to New York. And people, I could see people being happy there. They've had players that have had long careers and been beloved there.
Yeah.
So I think they're above another massive swath of teams in terms of consideration. So all it really takes is one. I don't know who that one is, but all it really does. I've been.
What would be the coolest result for me?
Okay.
Is if they got, well, first and foremost, like Caldwell Pope, I think this summer makes the most sense for them. But I would like to see them, and this could be a disaster, but I would like to see them make a run at Blake Griffin and put him next to Joel Embiid. And I understand that there would be problems with Ben Simmons there in terms of the way that those two would fit together. But I just think that Embiid covers up so many of Blake Griffin's problems that it's going to bring out the best in Blake. And as we've seen, the best in Blake is genuinely like top 10 player in the league.
You want to hear mine?
Yeah.
It requires a lot of patience and some good fortune, but also remember that the Sixers, partially due to Jahlil Okafor being a disappointment at this point, and, Stauskas is Stauskas.
Stauskas?
Yeah. Though him taunting the Kings was pretty rich yesterday about the draft pick stuff. But if Philly can maintain max space in 2020 I don't think there's a better destination for Anthony Davis.
That's a great one. Yeah, that'd be pretty challenging, just given their cap holds that they're going to have that summer. But I get it. I think that you can do what you can do to get Anthony Davis, right?
Right. And yeah, that's the summer where Ben Simmons and Dario Saric will be restricted free agents, so they'll have higher cap holds. But, you know, my logic is kind of that he's, as far off the top of my head, he's the next like truly elite guy that will hit unrestricted free agency. So if you can be in the mix for him, you make it work.
I mean, I guess like here's an interesting idea too. Like if they can make a run this year to at least like the 8 seed, do you think that entices Paul George, or do we think that Paul George is just straight up going to LA?
I think he'd be intrigued, especially if it looks like the Lakers are a few years away, because I think he'll be 28 when he's a free agent, and so that means his window for being a part of like a serious contender is pretty narrow, and players are getting more honest about that. So I think he'd consider it, but it's not like I think they'd get in the room, but I don't think they'd be anything close to the favorites.
Yeah, and Jimmy Butler is another one, right? Like Jimmy Butler is up in 2 years, right?
Right.
So like he'd be an interesting one because they don't really have a ton of shooting, or he doesn't really bring a ton of shooting, even though he's really improved in that way. But he would be an interesting fit as like a wing creator next to Ben Simmons if you're like married to this idea of Ben Simmons as lead ball handler.
Yeah, I'm just absolutely fascinated by the Sixers, and
me too.
If they approach this draft from a healthy perspective and basically just say, let's get somebody who can be a good player for us, and understanding that, especially since there aren't any centers on the board where they're going to pick, that the whole thing is in kind of flux. So just get whoever you think is best, or trade down and get some assets or something like that. Like
I think that they have to take a guard. I will say that now.
See, I don't. I think that they just take the best player available, whoever it is. And I love Ben Simmons. I thought he was the best player in that draft. I am not so confident in him that I would preclude myself from taking somebody just because I have him.
So here's kind of my reasoning on why I think they have to take a point guard here, or at least someone that they can play at the point guard position if you believe Ben Simmons is a point guard. So we talk about next year's draft class all the time, right? Like we talk about how the top of that class looks pretty great. If you look at who's at the top of that class, you got Luka Doncic, who is kind of like a 2-3 combo right now at 6'8", like who can handle the ball a decent amount. He's like a way better version of Dario Saric, who can play the wing instead of the 4, right? He's just kind of considerably better in all capacities, but he's not really a point guard, I think is what I'm trying to say here. Michael Porter is your 3-4. DeAndre Ayton's a center. Bamba is a center. Williams is a center. Miles Bridges is like a combo forward. Wendell Carter is a center. Like your best point guards in that class are Colin Sexton and Trayvon Duval. And I don't really think that either of those two, as much as I like both of those players, I don't really think either of those two are better than any of the point guards in this class, to be honest. Like I still think Dennis Smith is better than both of those two. So I think that you want to stick to guard here because it's your best chance to get the elite guard that you need.
If they are on that slower timeline that we talked about before of like 3 or 4 years out, I think you're right, because then that point guard can grow into it. The other way to handle that is
I also just want to
go ahead.
Can I follow up real quick on this too?
Of course.
So the next draft class in theory, like 2019, and we're getting so far into the weeds, we're getting so far out there, like to where these players still haven't developed in the way that they're going to. But that next point guard class and high school class is even worse. So this is really like, for me, their big chance to get a point guard. Otherwise, you're really limiting yourself.
I will take your word for it. You know those classes far better than I. But I also think that if their goal is to be competitive sooner, it could be wise to just get a point guard who's already more established. And we are reaching a point with the bumper crop where somebody like George Hill, somebody like Eric Bledsoe, where you just kind of go that route and make it and get a little bit more competitive, and you don't wait out a point guard if you don't think that any of them are worth it. If you do, then by all means. I mean, point guard, part of the reason it's such a value position is that you just, not only do you need one good guy there, you need 48 capable minutes. And sure, TJ McConnell can be a part of that, but it's good to have it from other players. So
is Eric Bledsoe though the point guard of your next contender though?
No, probably not. And so then that ties in with your point of you want to try to get that guy through the draft because it is hard to do that through free agency.
Right. So at least to me, that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at guys like Malik Monk even. Like if you think that he can create enough off the dribble in pick and roll settings to be like a secondary ball handler next to Ben Simmons, I look at that. If you think that Dennis Smith is just going to be a star, I take him. If you think De'Aaron Fox, even though he has the shooting concerns, if you trust your development staff to build up his body, that's who I'm taking. I mean, I get that, I have Jason Tatum at number 2 on my board, but if I was creating a Sixers specific board, I like his fit next to Ben Simmons, but it's just so incredibly important to me that they get this elite guard in play here.
I think that's certainly a fair point. Let's kind of move down the board a little bit. What teams in the late lottery are intriguing to you, both in terms of kind of where they are and who they could potentially draft?
So Sacramento has a lot of options, right? I mean, having both 5 and 10, how do they theorize this out? Do they go point guard at 5 and then hope that, a wing falls to them at 10? Do you reach for a wing at 10 if you take point guard at 5? Do you hope that a point guard falls to you at 10 and take one of the elite wings at 5? They're in a really tricky spot, I think, because I did James Ham's podcast earlier today, and I like the idea of De'Aaron Fox there a lot if he's there. I also have Jason Tatum at number 2 on my board, and I think he's a great fit there too, and I just think he's a better player than De'Aaron Fox. But I get that, like, at 5, your idea is you probably just want to take the best player available, but I think that more goes into it than that. You really need to do your due diligence in terms of what you think other teams are going to do. Do you think that, New York is definitely taking a guard? Do you think that Minnesota is definitely taking a forward? Or do you think that they could surprise? Because you need to come out of this draft with not just one good player, you need to come out of it with 2. You need to come out of it with, 2 of these top 10 consensus guys, not just, De'Aaron Fox and a reach on a wing player like Hamidou Diallo or whoever, right? You need to come out of this with 2 high-level assets, in my opinion. And it's more complicated than simply just saying, we're going to take the best player available at 5.
Especially if the point guard situation is what you think it'll be moving forward, because that will be hard for them to improve, to get a free agent. This is not Philadelphia where, they might have max space and have a really good team around it where they can woo the George Hills that come around. Sacramento is always going to have trouble with that. So in terms of resource management, it can be very useful for them. And they also have the benefit of waiting. They're not in a rush right now. They traded DeMarcus Cousins for Buddy Hield and the pick that is now number 10. So it takes a while with a 1, but they have the time to wait.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. Charlotte, I think, is a really interesting one too, because I think that they might end up stuck with Zach Collins, and I don't think that that's a bad thing necessarily. Zach Collins is a really, really good basketball player, but I think their fans might revolt if they take another tall white guy.
I mean, what makes that so much worse is that they traded for Miles Plumlee.
Yeah.
Because having 2 good centers is fine, especially if you can get them in the later part of the draft. I mean, think back to Indiana. They drafted Miles Turner when they already had Jan Mahimi. That worked out pretty damn well for them. Yeah,
no, for sure. You're 100% right there. Sometimes you just got to take the best guy available and, just have him beat the other guy out for the spot, right? I like what they have. Denver's in a really interesting spot because I'm sure that the Nuggets hope that this is the last year they're in the lottery, right? They're hoping all of their young guys kind of mature and are able to make that run toward the playoffs next year. So do they kind of look at OG Anunoby as the missing piece there? I know that they have a lot of offense, and Anunoby is potentially the best defender in this draft, I think. I look at Jonathan Isaac and I look at Jordan Bell and I look at, Josh Jackson as potential competitors in that way. But OG Anunoby, I think, is, again, right in that class with them. So do they decide that Anunoby is the player that is kind of their missing link in terms of being switchable defensively, as a guy that can protect the weak side of the rim for Nikola Jokic, as well as guard multiple positions and do a lot of things for what they're looking to do. I think it's a good fit, but I also think that he might be the worst offensive player in the first round. So does he fit with what they want to do offensively? It's a tricky spot.
I am also intrigued by the idea, and I mentioned this before, but it's important to repeat, of them trying to trade up because they have a lot of assets. They, whether it's players that are already under contract like Will Barton and Wilson Chandler, or, just kind of future assets, they could theoretically take on somebody with cap space. So what if you moved 13 and Emmanuel Mudiay for 5? Yeah. It'd be funny to see the Kings trade down again from a high pick, but I could see that totally working for them. And also keep in mind that they, maybe not necessarily with the Kings, but they have players, like Malik Beasley. Beasley's a really good player, but they also have Gary Harris and Jamal Murray. So if you want to cash in that resource at this point to get the right fit, and I think a lot of the forwards in this class fit incredibly well with Denver, and they don't necessarily conflict with what they want to do in free agency.
Yeah, I mean, they could go out and get Jason Tatum, Josh Jackson, or Jonathan Isaac, and that's going to be perfect for exactly what they want to do.
Plus, if they can move up there and get John Isaac, I think Isaac might be the most intriguing fit. You can go and you can make arguments for all these guys, but I think Isaac is intriguing as a fit next to Jokic with the switchability and everything else.
Sure.
If you can do that and still retain the space to sign Paul Millsap, you not only have your present, but you kind of have you're able to kind of fill 2 success cycles at once.
Yeah.
And those opportunities are very hard to come by.
Yeah, they really are. If they could find a way to end up with an elite player in the draft, like one of the top 6 players, as well as a guy like, Paul Millsap, or I'll throw the name Gordon Hayward out there, but I doubt that he's a possibility there. That would be genuinely a franchise changing offseason, and they have the assets to do it, I think, is the most important part. They genuinely have enough in their toolkit to be able to pull this off. And not only do you have Malik Beasley, you have Juancho Hernan-Gomez, you have, one of the point guards in Jamal Murray and Emmanuel Mudiay, depending on what the other team asks for. I'm sure that Denver values Murray considerably higher than they value Mudiay. But you have all of these assets going forward, and it's plausible to me that they could just simply decide, hey, this is what we're going for. This is what we're trying to do. We're going to make our splash now before we have to pay Nikola Jokic in the offseason next summer. And Jokic, that extension is fascinating to me too, because his cap hold is going to be so low. Denver essentially has this offseason and next offseason to make a move. Danilo Gallinari complicates this as well, to where I wonder if they should just bite the bullet and let him go.
I think they can just kind of play it by ear with him, see what he's getting offered, see what makes sense with it. I have a trade partner for you.
I'm in.
If they prefer Isaac. So because I think Josh Jackson's going to go long before this, and Tatum probably will as well. Orlando at 6.
Mm-hmm.
A, they need a shooting guard. Denver has 10 of them.
Yeah.
B, they need scoring. Denver has a lot of that. And C, if Denver was willing to part with Emmanuel Mudiay, that solves it doesn't solve Orlando's problems necessarily. That might be putting it too strongly, but it gives them more options.
Sure. So you're saying Mudiay and Beasley for 6.
Or, Beasley, Hernan-Gomez, and they have the 13th pick. Yeah, yep. And 13 for 6. That might...
Right, yeah.
Basically, you just figure out something in this pile of assets and work it from there.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting idea.
So that's one idea, and there aren't a lot of teams in the kind of the late lottery, other than Denver, that I think have a really good chance of trading up. Portland is technically outside of the late lottery because they have the 15th pick, and the 15th pick is as close to the lottery as you can get without actually being in. But they would have to really... I don't think that trading 2 or 3 late first-round picks gets you that far.
No, it's more of a nuisance at that stage. I don't think Portland takes their 3 picks, to be honest.
Yeah, they could use stashes. They could also use them, if they want to salary dump a guy or two. Portland also...
I have a Portland idea.
Okay.
I would try and move one of Portland's picks, maybe 20, and one of their contracts, be it Evan Turner or Alan Crabb or whoever Dallas would want, for Wes Matthews.
I don't think that's enough for their truly. I think that just straight up dumping their worst contracts is actually will cost more than a first round pick, more than the first round picks they have, like one of those. But
do you think that Alan Crabb is that negative of a value? Say it's Alan Crabb.
No, Crab's a tougher call. Like that he's different. He I could see an argument made for that. So basically then in some ways what Dallas is doing is they're saying we're probably not going to be a cap space team in the near term.
Yep.
And that might be a smart argument for them.
Yeah, like you end up with a younger player who could potentially be a piece on your next winner in Alan Crabb. You end up with a draft pick, which I think they're going to want to try and stockpile here going forward. Wes Matthews, why he's attractive to Portland. Portland obviously really needs to improve its perimeter defense. Matthews is still an excellent defender. Still really knows how to get after it on that end. Just as good of a shooter as Alan Crabb. I think that he would be able to step into that starting 3 role and really balance out their starting lineup, because then you could genuinely bring Al-Farouq Aminu off the bench and not lose anything in your starting lineup, right?
It's intriguing. And also Matthews kind of fits in with their financial timeline a little bit better, because while I would expect him to pick up his player option for 2018-19, it's, that's still closer, especially because that's the year they're going to be paying Nurkic, because, Nurkic is extension eligible now too. So
no idea what happens there. I would imagine Nurkic wants to play that out.
I think both sides are going to end up there, just because the Blazers will demand a concession and Nurkic won't want to make it.
Yeah.
So, but I've been wrong on those before. That's how I thought Gorgui Dieng was going to play out. I was wrong. I was real wrong. So you never know for sure. But one thing I do know for sure is how important it is in basketball to have the right players in the right situation at the right time. And really, business works the same way. And that's why I was really impressed with ZipRecruiter back when I was a prospective employee, and have the full confidence that it can work incredibly well for you as an employer. Finding people, the right people for your jobs has been a challenge for a long time, and don't want to put out feelers everywhere. It takes a lot of time. You have to filter through everybody to find the right fit. And what ZipRecruiter does is it accomplishes a lot of those different goals at the same time. You post your job to more than 100 job sites with a single click, and then you can screen, rate, and manage candidates all in one place. So you don't have to worry about even that part of the process. You can do it all through ZipRecruiter. It's a pretty amazing product for what businesses are looking for now, really at any part of the hiring process, whether you're looking for somebody more in a higher end position or you're looking for an entry-level person. It's a great way to go through all of that. And you can start building your team on ZipRecruiter for free. You go to ZipRecruiter.com/sportsfan and you can try it out. You can put up a job posting, and hopefully you will be as impressed with the product as I was when I was applying. And again, it's ZipRecruiter.com/sportsfan. And it's a great way to find the next person for your great job. I like the idea of teams becoming more realistic in terms of the value of their cap space. So you have two ways that this can matter. One is the value of your cap space. So this is basically teams in less desirable markets realizing that, hey, we're not going to get the next Anthony Davis.
Sure.
But the corollary is understanding that we're not going to have as much space, or we're not going to be able to use it as well. And that's more like what Phoenix can do, where they can say, hey, we're not going to clear max cap space. Is it better for us to just have like $10 million a year for a couple of years, or, cash some of this out and use that in different ways? Brooklyn, I think, has done a nice job of that recently. And those teams can and will benefit. I mean, we saw in this lottery one of the greatest examples of that in modern history with the Sixers.
Yep.
The Sixers took on money partially because the Kings made a bad trade offer and were desperate in the wrong way. But
they were desperate to get Rajon Rondo on a 1-year contract.
Yes. So important. So important. And also, I should mention this. My favorite harebrained idea that I've thought of, and it's not going to happen for obvious reasons, would be if the Bulls picked up his guarantee and then traded him to the Kings.
Why?
Because if the Bulls decided that they wanted cap space and the Kings realized they weren't going to get somebody better for next year.
Yeah, I guess. That'd be really funny.
It would be unbelievably funny, but it's not going to happen, because if the Bulls pick it up, it's to keep him.
Yeah, I think that is ultimately what happens. I think they pick it up and keep him.
I'm going to be so angry if their offseason is basically a holding pattern, because...
Oh, so will I, but I think that's what's going to happen.
Oh, absolutely. And they can look into the future right now. They can put on some sort of magic binoculars and just look at what happens to the Pacers this summer and say, is that really what we want to do a year from now? Because that's exactly where they're going to be.
If they decide that they want to pick up Rajon Rondo's contract, they should just trade Jimmy Butler now. Like, get the most value you can.
No, you know what they should do if they're going to do that?
They should trade Rajon Rondo. But
they should trade Jimmy Butler if they're going in that route. They should trade Jimmy Butler before Dwayne Wade has to decide on his player option.
Yes, I would agree with that too. That'd be excellent. That would be really, really smart. That won't happen, but that would be
it won't. But
that would be smart.
I think that's an overarching thing that we can talk about.
Here's the question: should they just trade him? Like, do you think that they should just trade him now? Do you think that in the next 2 years they can build enough of a contender around him to make it worthwhile?
I don't think they can. And a related problem is that while I love Jimmy Butler, I had him, as an all-NBA player.
Yeah.
I am not comfortable with the way that the salary cap is going. I am not comfortable giving him a designated veteran extension right now.
Yeah, because his will be at $30 million the year that he is eligible for an extension, right? Because he'll be assumedly all NBA in his 9th year.
Right. So
maybe 8th year because of the player option, sorry. But he's in the 7 to 9 band.
Correct. So if you give him that contract, he's a little bit older, so you're going to be paying him into his 30s. And Chicago isn't...
Well, he'll be 30 when that happens, right?
Right, he'll be 30 when it starts.
30, yeah.
And so he'll be in his 30s for that whole contract. And, he could age okay. He's improved so much over the course of his NBA career. But with any contract like that, you're relying a lot on front-end value because those players are always, especially if the cap's going to stay flattish, those players are going to be bad values on the later part of their contract. They're going to be hard to move, all that sort of stuff. Carmelo Anthony even was this, even if the Knicks didn't admit it. And he's fine at his number, but it's complicated. Chicago, as of now, does not look to be good enough in the first couple years of that contract to justify the last couple years of that contract.
Yep.
And if that's the case, if that's how they feel, and it should be how they feel, I hope they agree with me, then you move him because they can get an asset because he can make a team better right now. And that value proposition changes if they move him now for that other team for 2 reasons. One, presumably you're trading him to a team that's good right now, Boston, whoever. Also, they can't give him the designated veteran, so that takes away like the worst option from the table for them, which is valuable. Yeah,
no, it is. I guess that my idea for Jimmy Butler is they should just trade him to Boston now. I would say, give me I don't think Boston will trade the number 1 overall pick. I don't think they should, but I think that you could get the 2018 Nets pick. I think you could probably get 2018 Boston pick as well. I think you could get one of Avery Bradley or Marcus Smart, depending on which one you want to value more. Marcus Smart's a worse player on a more favorable contract that has rights going out into the future for the next potentially 5 years. Avery Bradley's a better player that's on a 1-year deal. Maybe you just want the cap space and you don't want to pay Marcus Smart. I don't know. You could get Jaylen Brown, who's on a cheap deal. You could get Terry Rozier, who could theoretically play point guard for you. There are a lot of options there. You could get Ante Žižić. You could get Yabusele if you want. Like, Boston has enough options to where they can make a Jimmy Butler trade work without 2017 number 1.
Right. And Boston has so many different assets at varying levels that it looks like they can make something happen because this isn't a kind of a situation where they have to hold their best things and they don't have enough to throw out there. Because that can always be a problem where,
right,
hey, we want to trade for X player who's certainly an elite talent, but we're not willing to give up X, Y, and Z. But
right.
Boston
You're killing yourself by trading one asset that you need next year to get another one, right?
Right. So Boston's in that space. Butler is a logical fit for it, and also his presence, especially if they can time this out right and use their cap space, basically agree to the trade at some point in the nearer term, and then consummate it after, which happens all the time. Like, that's not something bold, something new.
There's a problem with this, but go ahead.
There are a couple, but that they can get into this place where they can add somebody else with the sales pitch saying, hey, you're going to get to play with Jimmy Butler. Right.
So the kind of problem here, I guess, is that you have to do this all early, and Jimmy Butler you have to trade for Jimmy Butler after you sign a free agent, probably, right? Like
no,
the money,
I disagree.
You don't think so?
I think they try to trade for Butler on draft night or around draft night.
So that makes it really tight to go sign a Gordon Hayward then. And the thing is the only way that I trade for Jimmy Butler if I'm Boston is if I can get Gordon Hayward in free agency. Otherwise, I think if you're Boston, you're better off playing the long game to be the next team after LeBron, right? Like, if you don't get Jimmy Butler, I would probably trade Isaiah Thomas and like recoup all of the value for Isaiah.
Well, yeah, we've talked before about the idea that Isaiah's next contract is going to be absolutely terrifying.
Yes. Like, I would not want to, full stop. Isaiah is one of the 10 best players in the NBA right now. I do not want to pay that next contract. That is terrifying to me. And I might be wrong, and Isaiah has certainly proved all of us wrong in his career, and I root the best for him. I don't want to be the team that pays that money. With that being the case, if I am Boston, trying to position myself to be the next team after LeBron, and Jimmy Butler doesn't do that for me, I guess, right? Like, he's going to be 30 by the time that contract starts.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. And I think that it could, yeah, if you're focusing on ceiling, you could be right in terms of just him kind of being a little bit too old for everything there.
And I move Isaiah Thomas to what team needs a point guard right now?
So the other way to play the Isaiah Thomas thing, and I think a good GM, and I assume Danny Ainge would do this too if he was thinking about it the way that we are, is if a team doesn't make that offer at the beginning, like early on in free agency at some point, or even in later July, it doesn't really matter there, because that it affects how they're thinking about free agents, but on a real macro scale, I'm not sure it does. Because they're just going to be looking for good value wherever it is. And if they don't get Gordon Hayward. So,
well, their ultimate scenario is this summer, they end up with Gordon Hayward plus trade target plus Markelle Fultz. Like that sets them up for now and into the future.
Sure. But so what I'm getting at with Isaiah is I don't think they have to trade him this summer. If the offers are a little bit tepid, they could try to move him early in the season. So maybe you don't want to wait until the deadline because then he's a straight rental. But maybe in that, because I think they would want to know what they have in Markelle Fultz before they make that decision. And they're not going to know by the start of free agency, obviously. And that could be a nice little opportunity. Plus, there's the whole thing that I don't know if or how much they have a personal relationship, but maybe that could help a little bit. So Boston might need to be in the information gathering business for a little longer than they like, but their next calendar year is just so astonishingly interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, Boston is, like I said, they are the team best positioned to be the team in the East after LeBron right now.
Well, okay, so I want to give you a question. So we talked about the positioning after LeBron, and I agree with you on that. Let's say they paid a reasonable return for Jimmy Butler, and they retained everybody else, and they added Gordon Hayward.
Yeah.
Where would you put them in terms of the 2018 title picture?
So you're talking about a team that has Isaiah, Markelle Fultz. I would assume that Avery is still there, right? Like, I don't think that Avery is going to be the main piece.
Right, because he's a really illogical part of a Gordon Hayward of a Jimmy Butler trade just because he's an expiring contract.
Right. So you still have Avery. Then you have Jimmy Butler, Gordon Hayward, Al Horford.
And probably one of Jaylen Brown or Jay Crowder.
Yeah, I would probably say Jay is the one who goes just because his contract is so incredibly valuable. Also, I don't think he'd be super pleased, and I think you'd probably just want to get rid of that idea. You just want to not have to deal with that. So probably Jaylen Brown. You have Djigic. You have Yabusele, who I'm not sure what he is yet. You have what else? You probably don't have Terry Rozier, I will say. Yeah, I think that team's right on par with Cleveland. I mean, I'm not going to say they're better than any team with LeBron, but I'd say that they're 50-50 right there.
I'd say they're better than Cleveland. That doesn't mean they would win, but I'd say they'd be better because remember,
paper, they're better than Cleveland.
And remember that Cleveland will be a year older, and that matters more for them than it would for Boston because Boston would be younger. But at the same point, the other part I was getting at is I still wouldn't favor that team over the Warriors.
Oh boy. Probably not. No. Probably
but good
not.
Lord, would that be a fun series?
It would be an incredibly fun series. I still probably don't favor them over the Warriors, but it's deals that you have to make if they present the opportunity, right? Also, the Warriors, again, a little bit older than that team would be. Not super old, but I think we both think Draymond is probably going to age quicker than most players, right?
I think that I think offensively it could be a little bit of a challenge, but he's so smart. It could work out. But the question with him is quickness, because his recognition is already elite. Like, the reason he is the probable defensive player of the year is his combination of recognition and quickness. And he's not going to lose the recognition, but if he gets a half step slower, he just can't be everywhere at once in the same way.
Yeah, no, that's 100% right. Clay is going to be fine, probably. Stephen Curry. The thing with Curry is I don't think we need to worry about the ankles anymore, but they're always there in the back of the mind as he continues to age, especially. Who knows what happens. I still would take the Warriors, but it'd be close. Because like I said, you're talking Isaiah, Markelle, Avery Bradley, Jimmy Butler, Gordon Hayward, Al Horford, Jaylen Brown, probably, Gigic Yabusele, who else? There are so many dudes on that team, and you'd get like random free agents too.
Yeah, they would be one of the most enticing teams for minimum guys who are looking to make good. And
what they would have an exception too.
Well, they'd probably have the room exception, yeah. Depending on how
it'd be more than minimum. It'd be like what Zaza's getting this year.
It'd be more than that because they raised the room, but it'll be interesting. But it would also probably take some time to run through all that, so some guys might have already decided. But that gets into the key idea, I think, that actually amplifies your case in terms of why Boston should wait if they can't get Gordon Hayward. Because if that's what it takes to get past the Warriors and probably to get past Cleveland, you can't give up resources for anything less.
Yeah.
When you're as good as they can be long term. And then remember, I already floated the idea of Anthony Davis to another intriguing, talented Eastern Conference team. If he makes it to free agency, if he doesn't take the designated veteran, if he wants to win, Boston could be another place there because they just have so many assets that they're always going to be in the mix for guys. And with Davis, it would probably be via trade, not via free agency.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's all right. I also love how this turned from draft lottery podcast into projecting the future of the NBA podcast.
That's the way we do it, man.
It really is. Like, you never know how this conversation with you and I is going to go.
Especially because we never really plan it. And
no, you chat me and say, hey, do you have time to be on a podcast this week? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Anytime. And then we just start talking.
But something else I wanted to discuss briefly, it was just any takeaways you had. I didn't get to watch much of the Combine. I was busy. But were there any notable takeaways from it?
I think my main takeaway from the Combine is we need to find a way to make the Combine relevant. If the NBA really wants it to be a centerpiece of their draft season, right? Which I think it's pretty clear that they do. We need to find a way to make it matter more in the information age where NBA teams and even the public now, because of the great work that John Gavoni has done over at Draft Express, we already have so much information on these guys. 15 years ago in the early 2000s, the Combine was an incredibly valuable tool because it allowed us to get measurements and it allowed us to get athletic testing for the first time. And, a lot of the 5-on-5 guys showed up. Nowadays, not necessarily as valuable because even with the way that the public age has gone in terms of just data collection, NBA teams have databases of all of these measurements and all of the athletic testing they've done over the years, specialty events, and it's public now with Draft Express. Like I said, John's done a great job of keeping it public. So no matter what players do there, basically, they don't really raise their stock all that much, right? Hamidou Diallo measured 6'5" with a 6'11" wingspan, had a 44-inch vertical leap, had the best shuttle run of the Combine, literally could not have done anything more to theoretically help himself, but it doesn't really matter because we knew he was going to do all that, right? Hamidou Diallo, we know that he's this elite prospect with an elite frame. What does it matter? What he does at the Combine, I guess, right?
It's also complicated because basketball is a very different sport than football in terms of the way that it is scouted and the way that it presents itself. So the high level guys are never going to be, they don't need to prove themselves in a system in the same way because they've already done it. And so to me, Tom Ziller's mentioned this and I fully agree with it. One way to help the combine is to do it after the lottery, because then the more important part there is drawing people in to make it more of an interview space. And yeah, that makes it less fun for fans because that stuff will never be public. But at least then the talent is going to be in the building. And I think that's a nice little benefit of it that is not necessarily there because...
Are we sure they would be in the building?
No, but it seems more likely. At least they would...
I think it seems more likely, but I still don't think that, I don't think Lonzo Ball was showing up to the combine this year.
Well, if based on what happened in the lottery, you can be damn sure he wouldn't have showed up if what happened.
Right. No, but I think that with the way that representation is now, and this is not derogatory toward agents, I actually agree with everything that they do in this way. I think that it just, they're never going to send guys, they're never going to send Jason Tatum to the combine as currently constructed, just because what's the purpose of sending him to the combine? One thing that Paul Flannery, it was me, him, and Ricky O'Donnell talking, and his idea was if you don't go to the combine, you can't go to the draft. I thought that was an interesting idea. It's not I feel like everyone wants to go to draft night, right? So, or at least in the NBA, it's a lot more prevalent that you want to do that versus the NFL where it's not necessarily as big a deal. I think that would be one way to improve it, certainly. Just
sure. And what you would have to do there, putting on my lawyer hat for a second, is you would have to do it just for appearance. You can't make them do the athletic testing or the 5-on-5 because then the insurance part of it's going to kick in. But right. You can make them show up and that would help. Yeah,
no, you could just make them show up, make them do media obligations. And, the big one that NBA teams want is they want everyone to go through medical testing, right? They want to be able to meet with these players and go through medical testing. That's the two most important parts of the NBA draft combine. And that's what makes it valuable for them to still go to the combine and make it a piece of their offseason. I would imagine that you being a lawyer, you would not be forced. No player would be forced to go through medical testing, right?
I don't think so. I think that gets into a lot of discretionary stuff that would be uncomfortable.
Yeah. So it gets really tricky. One other one that I heard, and I forget who said it, so I'm not going to say the name. But he said, try and tie a rookie scale to it. You're not eligible to get 120% of the rookie scale. You can only get 100% of the rookie scale if you don't go to the combine.
That's way too complicated. It's possible. I think first of all, you'd have to agree to that in the CBA. But both sides could do that. The reason that I think that's a bigger issue is the international guys, because it's not fair to put that restriction on Frank when his team is still playing. It's yeah, I'm not going to be there at the combine because I'm actually playing professional basketball right now.
Yeah. Part of the reason that I didn't want to say who told me it is because I don't really think it's a good idea.
It's always nice of you.
It was at least just a thought, though, that I would throw out. I think there are ways to do it, but the NBA needs to do something because the combine this year is just kind of a drag. It was somewhat useful for NBA teams, but not as useful as the event should be.
It's also very fair to say that it will never be what the NFL combine is for a million different reasons. And so,
but why does ESPN have 8 hours of coverage of the NBA draft combine? What are we doing here?
I think they're looking for content during the day. And, I think it's good to have a presence. You
have to pay to produce the NBA draft show. Do we really think the NBA draft combine is getting any sort of higher ratings than you already having set up a studio in Bristol?
Well, so then you have the question of, is it, because I think having filming of the testing stuff would derive value, not necessarily airing it on the main network. Maybe you have that on ESPN Now or whatever they're calling it at the moment. That might be a way to do it. Mm-hmm. I don't know personally how that differs in terms of cost with production and everything else from having, having staff there in a more direct sense. But I also think there is a certain part of it that maybe you don't do it by ESPN, maybe it's on NBA TV or something, where it's about kind of keeping up interest in that part of the process. It is at a time when people who are fans of teams that are not presently relevant in the playoff structure can have some interest, but maybe you package it very differently for television and use the NBA's resources as opposed to using ESPN's, but they can do whatever they want with their money.
Yeah. And by the way, like, it was a super valuable event for me. I talked to DJ Wilson for the first time. I talked to Terrence Ferguson for the first time, but I talked to him like for one of the first times I talked to him. I've talked to like now Shemi Ojale for the first time. Like, it was a super valuable event, and I'm going to get a lot of great feature content on it. Jawan Evans is another one that I'm going to write about tomorrow at Vice. But like, in a practical sense, I guess, in an efficiency sense, I'm not sure it's useful.
You brought up Terrence Ferguson. I want to say, just ask you kind of briefly, why is he, like, it looks like he's kind of lower in stuff right now, considering scarcity. Doesn't it make sense for a team to just to roll the dice on him just on the idea that if he can become a rotation player, maybe even a starter, it's just so valuable? Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to NBA teams there. They were telling me like, he might not be in the 20s. Like, he might not be a first round pick. Like, he's still so far away from being a contributor. I don't necessarily know that I buy that. Like, I have him inside of my top 20, but he's certainly not at the like top 12 spot that like a lot of people had him coming into the combine before. More than anything, the combine kind of acts as a convention, right? Where you get a chance to chat with a lot of your friends that you haven't seen over the course of years and everything. And that's really valuable for sure. What I will say is that he did not have an incredible year in Australia. I think that his year has been somewhat overstated in terms of badness. Like, he was still a top 10 spot up shooter in Australia this year that has defensive versatility and, PER and, all of the efficiency metrics. They always undervalue, spot up shooters like Klay Thompson and, guys of his ilk. So Ferguson, I think, has a long way to go in terms of body, but he sits down, he defends, he's quick, and he can shoot. That matters. I mean, that stuff is incredibly valuable, and we'll see what happens with him, basically. Like, I'm not killing him, but like, I would take him at like 19 or 18, no problem, and not think twice. Like, the thing that we haven't talked about yet, and I know that this is one thing that like you and I will love to talk about just because we've been preaching this for years. A lot of people have like, and I don't mean to, disparage John Gavoni and everyone at Draft Express. Like, they do the best job of this. They're so much better at this than I am that I can't even begin to like comprehend. But one thing that they have right now is I think that 17 of the 24 players from 11 to 34 in their combine right now, or in their mock draft right now, are true big men. Like, guys who, when you're closing games, will play center. I don't see how that happens on draft night, I guess. Like, I think right now in my top 34, something like 12 guys or so. Like, I've specifically tried to pare it down because I just don't see how that many bigs go in an era where bigs are becoming less, or at least true bigs that you have to close as fives with, are becoming less valuable by the day.
And you can even think back to last year. First two picks of the second round were Deontay Davis and Zubac. Both those guys, you could make a very easy argument, were first-round talents, but part of the reason they fell was because of the lack of positional scarcity. And they fell. Sheikh Diallo was third. And, all those guys are, I would say all those guys have given you reasons for their teams to be happy with those selections. But it's why guys like Malachi Richardson went up into the first round. It's why,
I mean, and so Luau Cabaret was a first-round pick.
If you look at last year's draft, and just how few swingmen were available. So I'm going to count Brogdon as a 1, which is complicated, but Zagorak...
I would count him as a swingman because I don't think we knew he was going to be a 1 coming into last year.
That's fair. So Zagorak, Pat McCaw, Brogdon, Whitehead, I guess?
I'd count Whitehead as a guard.
Isaiah Cordonier, and
probably a guard as well.
And then Zipser.
Jake Layman, probably.
Yeah, I consider Layman a 4, but yeah, I mean...
Benajay,
and then, but like, that's that list is so thin, and that's why you have to take those guys high. Because I mean, and McCaw and
Wyatt Zipser rated as a first rounder last year.
Yeah, and I think your ruling on that was correct. But
I mean, athletic guys that can shoot are scarce in today's NBA.
So I think you're right that will change, but of course, I always think of mocks at this point with so much time left as being more kind of like a rankings that are slightly adjusted based on team needs, and then once you start getting that intel in, it'll change. Now, if we're saying that on June 10th, then we'll be having a bit weird. We'll be having a different conversation, but
like the wings that I have moved up a little bit higher than where I think most people have them right now. I probably have Ferguson a little bit higher. I definitely have Diallo a little bit higher. I have Shemi Ojeleye a little bit higher, even though he kind of profiles more as a 4, but he's still good. I have Derek White higher from Colorado. I have Josh Hart higher. That's probably
What about Dylan
it.
Brooks?
I don't think Dylan Brooks is an NBA player.
Okay, good to know.
So we talk about like who do you guard on the NBA level? I don't. He's going to be best off guarding 4s, but he's 6'6" with a 6'6" wingspan, and he's not like super powerful. Like he's not Jay Crowder whenever it comes to having short arms, but strength wise. So I'm not like super duper high on him.
That makes sense. I have one more. Is there anything else in terms of like the way this is kind of shaping up that you feel like we need to talk about? And then there's one other question I want to ask you. Well, what's happening with Harry Giles?
I like the point guards a lot.
Okay.
I'll say the point guards first. I like the point guards more than I think most people do, even beyond the top level, right? Like I'm higher on Jawan Evans than a lot of people are. I have him as top 20 player. I have, Frank Mason is like a top 35 player, like top 40 level player. I have Monte Morris as a top 40 player. Even guys like I'm not higher on Andrew Jones and Edmund Sumner and Kobe Simmons, like those guys. But I think that the 3 Big 12 point guards are going to give this draft like the kick in the ass it kind of needs to get the backup point guard position stronger in today's NBA. But let's talk about Harry Giles. Harry Giles, no one knows.
It's Period. So wild to have a player with that much talent that is just such a big question mark. It's kind of like Scal, but a very different case.
It's like Scal, except where we don't know how he's going to medically test. We don't know how he is going to like grade out athletically whenever teams get him in for individual workouts where like they put him through their scheme and everything. We don't know how he is going to be in terms of confidence levels. Every single thing is a question mark right now with Harry Giles, and I feel terrible for the kid.
It also makes total sense for him if he's worried at all about how that could shake out to do that work more on a team setting, because then it's more private, even if it does come out a little bit through leaks or whatever. And I think there will be some devastating ones on him just because it's tactically advantageous, even if a team likes him, to just be like, oh, he was so disappointing or something like that. But
well, I mean, what's going to happen is someone's going to get a report of his medical stuff. Just like how we kind of did last year with Denzel Valentine. And, trust me, I was trying to report the Denzel Valentine thing and ultimately decided not to go with it. It's going to come out. It's just going to happen. And I feel really bad for the kid.
So the last question I wanted to ask you is a basic clarification one. I would prefer not to get into a lot of the other big picture parts of it, but as a draft expert, will LeVar Ballness hurt Lonzo Ball, either his draft stock or him as a professional?
Oh, we're having this conversation on the perfect day too, after what happened on Fox. No, he's not going to hurt Lonzo at all. LeVar is a very complicated figure, obviously, for a lot of reasons. He is kind of a bad dude, I would say, after his comments today, where he wasn't even looking at Christine Leahy on Colin Cowherd's show, and was talking all kind of stuff on Jason Whitlock being fat, and you can disparage his character all you want, and you probably are in the clear, given the fact that he's also like said publicly, I married my wife so that I could make basketball players. Like, I think there's a very realistic case that he is a problematic figure in terms of the way that he thinks of women. But the one thing that I will say for him is that he raised a very good kid in Lonzo, and that's ultimately what this comes down to. Lonzo is a very respectful kid that just wants to play basketball and is quiet. He's stoic. He also has a great mentality in terms of wanting to be a killer basketball player on the floor. Not someone that like goes clubbing, not someone who is, knock on wood right now, going to develop into a problem or anything. And I think that in an NBA where you often don't see that, there are plenty of NBA players that came from single parent households and everything. I think LeVar deserves some credit for that. And ultimately what it comes down to is how you trust the kid in the draft process. And I think there are plenty of reasons to trust Lonzo as a kid in the draft process. He is, I have yet to find something problematic about him. So ultimately I think, no, he won't hurt it, but it's not a great look for LeVar to continue to do this stuff.
It isn't a great look for him personally, but it's also easy if he wants to separate that stuff out for Lonzo. If he wants to live his life, even in LA, even with all of that, with same broad metropolitan area where he grew up, where his family is, he can. Being an NBA player is a lot of work. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of that. Your family and your circle can be as big or as small a part of that as you want them to be. And all the rest of it is noise. If he wants it to be more than noise, he can make it more than noise, but he doesn't have to. And what strikes me about Lonzo is that LeVar Ball has been this kind of a figure, from what I understand, for a while. It's just more public now.
For genuinely Lonzo's entire life.
So it's not really that different for him. And he was a significantly positive force at UCLA in a situation that is fairly comparable to an NBA team in terms of going in to a place that already has an established structure that existed before you and will exist long after you, with some holdover players and some new ones. And he was huge. He was a significant force. I think he was a big part of why they were so successful last year. And yeah, I mean, he had that big struggle in the Kentucky game. And I mean, I would pay good money to see a De'Aaron Fox versus Lonzo Ball workout if the Lakers can pull it off, which I don't think they can. But
it was genuinely funny to me in that Fox interview when LeVar said, yeah, Lonzo won't hide from anyone. He'll go do that workout. I'll be surprised if they get that workout.
So will I. But the point of it is, this is all on Lonzo, and it's a great transition into being an adult in terms of, choosing what is a part of your life. And it will be totally possible for him to make the right decision there. And the evidence that we have is that he will make the right decision.
And you know what? Like, I don't even know that it's like the right decision to like take LeVar out of his life, right? Like, he's his dad.
No. It's not to take him out of his life. It's just to treat this as kind of like a side thing and just make sure that your job is your job.
Yeah. And that's something that Lonzo has done his entire life. And I'm not worried about that. Obviously, it's going to be on a much bigger scale now with LeVar getting TV appearances and everything like that. Lonzo is going to be fine. Like, when this stuff happened at UCLA, like, someone would come in and tell Lonzo, oh, LeVar said something. Oh, what did he say? He said X, and it was ridiculous. And Lonzo would be like, that's dad. Okay. And then, like, everyone on UCLA's team, like, as far as I know, no one had a problem with Lonzo. Like, no, TJ Leaf was asked this at the combine. He was like, no, I love Lonzo. He's one of my best friends. And, LeVar's fine. Like, he's a good dude. Like, every time I met him, he's fine. So, like, I don't think it's going to be a problem with the team. LeVar wasn't in their, like, locker room, like, being helicopter dad or whatever. Like, the parents in the NBA are so separated from the, like, player in the NBA, right? And LeVar still has, like, one kid in high school, still has, a mother who, Ramona Shelburne got the story this weekend. His wife just had a stroke. So like he's going to have to be devoting time there, obviously. Like it's not going to be a situation, in my opinion, where it's going to continue to be this loud throughout Lonzo's entire career. I think that this is a pre-draft thing only. And as Lonzo settles into his career, there are just going to be so many other things going on with what's going on with Big Baller Brand and what's going on with their family that I think it's going to be fine. And, honestly, hopefully also like hopefully Tina Ball gets healthy, because I think that should be said as well.
Absolutely. And best wishes to her. But the other part of this that I find intriguing, and we could call it amusing, is the father-son dynamic that matters in the NBA is the one that happens in the same city on the other team. Doc Rivers, Austin Rivers, coach, player, GM, player, that matters because that affects the contracts, that affects playing time, that affects everything else. Unless Lonzo is going to be in the locker room and stuff after games, the Lakers can insulate themselves as well.
Yeah. And that's what'll happen.
Yeah, I assume so. I mean, teams are prepared for this sort of thing, even if they don't have to deal with it very often. I mean, the families are very close to that sort of stuff, but they're not in the mix unless the team kind of wants it to be.
Yeah, no. And LeVar is, I have some significant questions about LeVar's personality, certainly, but he is not going to jeopardize Lonzo's career. Like, if the Lakers or whoever takes him says this is becoming a problem, it'll be taken care of, and it'll stop being a problem, basically.
One more quick thing, because I love French big men. What do you think about Jonathan John's combine?
John. Interesting. He's better. He looked better than any time I'd seen him on tape. I'll say that. Like, I was not like a huge fan of his. Came in a little bit like less long than anticipated, 9'5.5" standing reach. Like, everyone had thought that, like, and he even told me this after he'd been measured. And, while we were talking in like the media part, whereas I think it was just me and him, maybe me and one other person. He was like, yeah, I have like a 7'9" wingspan. And I was like, well, he just got measured at like 7'6". So, definitely a little bit shorter in terms of arm length than we thought. 2-inch shorter standing reach than Rudy Gobert. Little bit more fluid and skilled offensively at this stage than Rudy was. I don't think they're going to be similar players, though. Ultimately, I think what's going to happen is that he is just such a major project that, like, it's going to take so much time to get him to where he is a valuable NBA rotation player. Like, he's just so skinny. He's going to get beat up, I think, in the NBA right now. But if you draft him, you're hoping for 3 years down the road, you have a valuable rotation player, and then maybe 4 or 5 years down the road, you have a guy that can be a legitimate starter or something. I don't know. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Project Big Men in general, so I have him as a second round grade, but I wouldn't be surprised if a team takes him in the first.
Considering how far away it sounds like he is, I actually like those guys going with the last few picks of the first round, because getting that 4th year of team control before you have to make a decision is massive.
But the problem with that is, though, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Go ahead.
Is that he told me that his preference would be to come over immediately instead of waiting.
I'm okay with that.
And I think it would be best for his development, certainly, to be over here. But you also are essentially punting on the first, maybe even the second year of his rookie scale contract, right?
But you can do that. I don't have a real problem with that when you consider the everything else of it. And remember, so the guy who I think of for this, partially because, it's the team that I spend the most time around, is Festus Ezeli. Mm-hmm. The Warriors benefited so much from drafting Ezeli 30th and Draymond Green in the second round, because that gave them an extra year to figure out what Ezeli was. And they knew, granted, they had to pay Draymond earlier, but they knew what they were getting with him. And so it worked out so much better that way than if it was the reverse, even if they would have gotten another cost-controlled year of Draymond Green.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
I feel like that's more than enough, so thank you so much for taking the time.
I think my body is genuinely weak. Like, I have only had, my girlfriend, as I think I've said on this podcast before, is from Australia, and her parents were in town and brought back crumpets. So all I had today was an apple and a crumpet, and it's now like 1:30, and my body is slowly but surely shutting down.
Well, I appreciate you letting it shut down for this, and I'm sure we'll talk at some point in the near future.
Yeah, we'll probably do something pre or post draft. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks again to Sam Vecenie for taking the time to come on. You can read him all over the internet, including the Sporting News, which has his draft boards this year. Very happy about that. And you can follow him on Twitter at Sam_Vecenie. That's SAM_VECENIE. Really do enjoy talking with him, one of my favorite guests. And we covered a lot of ground in this one. It was, as we talked about during the show, it's like, we never really know exactly where it's going to go. We have some ideas of specific things we want to discuss. But I thought it was a very worthwhile and fun conversation. So hope you enjoyed it as well. If you want to support the show, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can leave a rating. You can leave a review. You can subscribe, download every episode. Those are particularly great for Real Jam Radio because the release is sporadic. You can also spread the word however you want, word of mouth or word of internet. And you can also check out our sponsors. That's a great thing to do to support this and any other shows you like. ZipRecruiter.com, you can post jobs for free at the URL ZipRecruiter.com/sportsfan. And this is a really fun, busy time. I mean, granted, the games haven't been the most exciting. I'm recording this on early Friday morning, the outro to this episode. And, we haven't exactly seen the most exciting conference finals, but still a lot on the horizon. And if you want to check out my work also, you can read my off-season previews there at Sports Illustrated this year. Still really cool to say. I think about 8 or 9 of them are up right now. Have another few that are ready to roll, and then going to be working on that over the weekend too. So going to have those kind of keep going on full force, and then going to have some other stuff as well. I get inspired all the time, and it's just when I have the time to write. So I want to do something on designated veteran extensions. And then, of course, you can check out Dunked On, which I do with Nate Duncan. And we actually just had our first Patreon subscriber-only mailbag. So we did over an hour of just questions that subscribers sent us, and you can get that patreon.com/Duncan Leroux. You can check that out. We have other exclusive content too, but I think that's the big thing that people want, our exclusive podcast. So we dropped one of those today. It was fun to do that. And so I'm going to have a new Real Jam Radio next week. Depending on the timing of these series, it might actually be an NBA Finals preview. It really is going to depend on how all this works out. Might do some team-specific stuff based on the lottery, but I also might want to wait a little bit, especially because some of the teams like the Celtics, there's a lot going on. So we'll have to figure all that out, but lots of time to do so. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback, good, bad, or indifferent, DannyLerouxNBA@gmail.com, @DannyLeroux on Twitter. If you take the time to write it, I will take the time to read it. No promises that I'll respond, but I try. And that's enough for now. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make it a great day.